So I'm Danielle. I'm a New York City-based dominatrix, and I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which transference takes place in my practice. And as someone who doesn't have a therapist training, I was hoping to speak to a therapist to learn a little bit more about what transference is and how it takes place in different contexts.
My name is Avigail Hurvitz-Prinz. I'm a New York City-based therapist and social worker. My training is psychodynamic, which might have some meaning to some of the people in the room and some of the people on the internet. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But part of why it's really fun to be able to do this is because transference and counter-transference are the place that I work. Not all therapists would say that that's what they're doing. So I'm from a particular school, I have a particular training. We'll get to talk about that a little bit, but it's really fun to be really fun.
And maybe once we're done talking, before we go into the conversation here and turn off the internet, we'll take a few questions at the end.
My turn?
Yeah, your turn. Go for it.
So like I said, my name is Abigail. I am a psychodynamically trained psychotherapist. My training is also relational. When I think about what that means, I often will think about the fact that I'm kind of like a great-great-granddaughter of Freud, who read queer theory and feminist theory and integrated some of the criticisms of those elders and tries to integrate them into my work. So when Freud was talking about transference and also counter-transference, he was pretty concerned about it in a way that the contemporary era that I'm a part of doesn't share the same assumptions. So you might encounter other therapists who are more in alignment with Freud and his ideology. That's fine. It's just not how I work. So Freud had a framework for thinking about the ways that people are having big feelings sometimes. Necessarily in the context until you think about the big arc of their lives, not something that's necessarily happening in the present moment, but something that is historical or something that is related to other relationships that they've had. So that's when a client is having a feeling about the therapist, or a patient in his framework is having a feeling about the therapist. That's called transference for Freud. And he also had a lot of concern about counter-transference, that the therapist would have feelings about the client. In Freud's day, and for many of his immediate proteges, that was a problem. Like, if you were having counter-transference, you were unanalyzed and not a good enough blank screen to be able to be in the therapist relationship. You had to do some more work to make sure that you weren't having any of your own feelings. In the contemporary moment, and certainly in the way that I'm trained, the transference and counter-transference matrix, because it's something that we build together in real-life relationships and is influenced by specific people who have specific unconscious minds with their own histories, that's the place where the dynamic thing is happening. That's where the work is. And so there's no expectation that any of us are going to be a blank screen anymore, or in the modality that I'm going to subscribe to. There's much more of an expectation that you know what's coming up for you and try to figure out, okay, what's mine, what belongs to the patient, and what's the thing that we're generating together, and where is the place that we can influence that and talk about that and work it so that that can be a healing experience. I'm getting some nods from some of the therapists in the room, which feels nice. But if anyone, I'm open to hearing other people's revisions on my definition, if there's something that you feel like it's missing, or something that you have a question about at this point. We also told people they didn't have to talk if the video was on, so they might not.
Just hearing you say that makes me know that this is a relational therapist. She's always talking about the way that the work that we're doing is like the co-creation of information, like taken from both of us to create new meaning. Right. I guess that part of that is transference and counter-transference.
For sure. And we were talking before this session started about times that stuff gets kicked up between you and a client, and that can sometimes feel like, well, where the fuck did that come from? That's an experience sometimes of what therapists will often call, or like relational therapists will call an enactment, and that is a place where, wow, I didn't expect that big thing to happen, but now that it's happened, like, what are the ways that we're going to make meaning out of it? And so I have a feeling that that's an experience that the doms in the room might feel some recognition around, or maybe not right now, but if you think about it, you might come up with against moments where you're like, oh, that thing really got out of hand and I don't know why. In a therapeutic context, that would be a moment where I would definitely be going to supervision and saying like, oh, this thing happened and like I'm so overwhelmed and I don't know how to think about it yet. My feelings are being kicked up. Their feelings are being kicked up. Like, how do I work this? And through conversations with trusted colleagues, sometimes I'll figure out, okay, I think I know what's going on because I have some stories from this person's experience and I have some stories from my own experience, and I think we were like creating the perfect storm because they were evoking the parts of me that they needed to work through in this moment. And that's a place where you guys for sure play.
Yeah.
Not to set you up and tell you what you do, but it's like that's part of your work.
Yeah, and I think the times that I've been most aware of transference and counter-transference in my practice have been at the point of like conflict or at the point of a boundary change, and then those changes of boundaries or the times where I've like stepped off of a pedestal to like be human or like have to cancel because I have a headache, or like be unable to maintain the level of intimacy and attunement in like an overnight session, and like sort of when the fantasy dips, some sort of problem comes up and there's this like where I become like the imperfect caretaker, and I see it play most in my practice with folks who have histories of childhood histories of abuse, especially, and sort of and like finding the psychological language to talk about these things has been really helpful for me in my practice, because I don't feel like as kinksters, when these things come up, that we necessarily have the language to talk about it. And so we've been talking a lot about this, and so much of like BDSM is a somatic-based practice, and so much of it's happening in the body that oftentimes like I don't feel like I have the language to describe what's going on. So the little language that I do have to like work through it, I find really helpful.
And I will say, like, I'm not a somatically trained psychotherapist, and so there are parts of me that I think you guys have. There are parts of my practice that I think you guys would be able to see. I'm looking at the DOMs. That I'm not sure I have language for or am attuned to in the same way. Also because I don't usually sit on this couch. I sit across the room from somebody watching them. So I don't have the same kind of embodied experience of them. And that's a place of real anxiety for therapists, I think, partly because of our history of boundary violations, where there have been many, many therapists who've gotten in trouble over the years, like reasonable trouble, because they shouldn't have done it. They were boundary violators. But places where therapists have used their power over people to manipulate sexual relationships with their clients. That's a place of real anxiety for a lot of therapists, which is probably coming up for me in this conversation as well, where I'm like, oh, I'm on the internet talking about sex with a dom. Like, I don't know how many of my colleagues are going to understand what that means or why there's a place of connection here. But I do think, and I said this to the group as you guys were coming in, we're intimacy experts, we're like relationship experts, and we're here, like each of us in our own roles, in our own ways, thinks about being a really good caretaker for people in specific ways within particular negotiated frames. And I think one place of privilege that I have is that I have like social standing in the world at large that is a little bit compromised in some ways by having this conversation, or I'm concerned. I'm not saying it actually is, but I notice that I'm feeling concerned about that. So talking about sex explicitly or talking about the erotic explicitly is a place of a lot of anxiety for therapists, I think.
And talking about the similarities between our jobs and our professions.
Right. So thanks for being willing to let me work out my stigma fears.
Of course.
Well, I have an anecdote, if that's helpful. I presented at the Alt Sex Conference 2 years ago, which I think is where Blunt and I met. And one of the things that happened was at the very end, anyone who presented that day sat on a panel together, and we just fielded like random questions from the crowd. And there came a moment where I found myself talking about the experience of having a known and felt sense that there was trauma in the room, and not exactly knowing why or how I knew that. But there was something in my there's something in the way that I felt in my own body that I thought something is amiss with this person, and there's something hurt that they don't know how to talk about yet, or there's something, and it's really hard to even talk about, but that when I talked about, sometimes when I know that there's trauma, but I don't know why I know that, I feel nauseous, or I feel dizzy, or I feel like spacey, and I've forgotten something, but I can't remember what. Like, those are feelings that come up for me when I'm sitting with somebody's trauma that is still unnamed, potentially. The DOMs in the room were like, I know exactly what you're talking about. That has happened to me, and there was a lot of interest.
The DOMs like took over that part of the conversation, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the experiences that put language to. I went to a psychosomatic conference at Columbia 2 years ago around the same time, and they were talking about somatic counter-transference, where you're like feeling what a client is feeling in their body. And it had happened to me a few times when I was playing. I usually will have someone kneel at my feet and like sync my breath to theirs and like watch their body. And there was this one person who I was doing it with, and I immediately just like fell out of my body, and like my arms started tingling, and like I had to work really hard on staying grounded. And we worked a lot with their disassociation in the like somatic practice that we were doing. But like I spent 2 years not having language for what was happening in my body, and like not really being able to talk about it. Because it's not. It also like sounds crazy. It sounds kind of crazy. Yeah. And I think it's like the empathetic attunement response when you are that attuned. And I think the people who are engaging in this type of play are seeking attunement, just like in therapy. But when the bodies are involved, I feel like so much more goes in and out of the body. And so one of my interests in this conversation is like trying to remember and learning more about these things. So like I know what's mine and like what I should take responsibility for, and like what I know what someone else is working with. And so I can be more aware of like how we're maybe playing out a narrative that I wasn't as aware of. Or like I also think a lot of it about like these neural pathways that are carved into our heads, and like with the frame that we've created, how easy it is to just replay the ones that we already know, like to come to a path that our other relationships have ended, or if we've been failed by a caretaker in some capacity, to only be able to see relationships in that light, rather than like I'm a flawed person who like can sometimes admit when I'm wrong, but
well, that's all I work.
Exactly. But like rather than seeing me as a different person, all of these assumptions are then projected on me, and I think that's the area we're interested in.
It's not just that they're projected onto you, part of it is being evoked in you also, and that's part of what's so complicated. Like I think that psychoanalysis has some language for what's called projective identification, where you sort of like, it's really, these are like complicated themes, and I'm going to do a shitty job translating concepts, but you evoke a feeling that you need someone else to have because you can't hold it yourself in somebody else. So like that person is being whatever the feeling is that you don't want to be feeling, that you know that you don't know, because it's all happening in the unconscious. And again, like some people don't believe in an unconscious. I do. I think it's like part of what makes humans so rich and interesting. But again, that's like part of my particular therapist pattern and training. But projective identification, the way that it was written about by the early psychoanalysts, I don't think was talked about in embodied ways. It was about feelings, which are certainly embodied experiences, but it's sort of hard to figure out where the thing ends and starts. So those are some things that come up for me, and I'm just going to take a look at my notes. Oh yeah, that's pretty much what my notes have.
I think too, it's like I'm thinking a lot about archetypes, and I think a lot of DOMs explicitly play with archetypes in the play, and I know in some of my work I don't do strict role plays where I'll stick to a script, but I will sort of fall in and out of mommy to daddy to babysitter to different types of caretaker roles, and working with whatever is coming up in the room. And I feel like there's a lot of transference that's happening with those, and I think especially one of the differences that we were talking about in our work is the frame. you want to talk a little bit about about the frame in therapy and some differences that we might see in like 24/7 DS relationships or in sex not on an hourly basis, like if you have someone who you're going out with for an evening or doing an overnight with, and like some of the protective features of the frame.
Yeah, we were thinking about this because I do think that part of, again, managing that anxiety about intimacy and being available to people in particular ways, but not overly available to people, is that therapists, generally speaking, practice, this is obviously, there are many exceptions, but in the training that I had, the expectation was certainly that you were seeing somebody once a week, twice a week, maybe 3 or 4 times a week if you're still practicing kind of like a psychoanalytic kind of, that happens, it happens in New York, it happens lots of places in the country, but by and large, I have 45 minutes with somebody in a week, and so it's very easy for me to contain that relationship, and we have a negotiation about, this is the time that we see each other, and you can imagine whatever you need to about me, and you can ask questions about me, and certainly I'm more present for you than just those 45 minutes, right? Part of the way the thing works is because you're integrating my voice into the voices that you have in your introjected imagination of like what people might say to you, or like how people react, or I don't know, it's just like I'm another character in your mind. But in terms of real contact, 2 hours a week is pretty contained.
Do you get like hundreds of emails that say, "Are you available?"
Definitely not, and that's a place of real safety for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, though, that like someone would think that it's okay to send that to us, like the DOMs in the room or the sex workers in the room. But there's something about the like professionalized and contained frame of what a therapist does that they know what to do to get an appointment.
Yeah, they know what to do to get an appointment, more or less, and there's also a lot of respect about my professionalism. Like, people often tell me I'm a doctor. I'm not a doctor, but they will refer to me as a doctor because that's how they imagine. I have a lot of the it's an elite position that I'm in, and it's not lost on me that I inhabit a role that's pretty easy to be very respectful and deferential to, and not in the same way that people are respectful and deferential to you guys. But maybe there are overlaps also.
Yeah. Well, I think that will be our conversation because
right.
So we can talk after the frame.
Right.
Talk a little bit more about the.
Do you have anything else that you're noticing about frame? I should say, I don't usually sit here, and I sort of acknowledged this before. I usually sit, 6 feet away, more or less, 5. And that if I ever come over to the couch, I pretty quickly find a way to get back to my seat, and that's part of my comfort level about establishing a certain amount of boundary distance. I also generally, I'm like feeling ambivalently in case any of my clients are watching, but I don't generally wear contacts to work. I usually wear glasses, and I've talked to my own, my supervisor about how that actually is a part of my boundary setting for myself, that like there's something about being too permeable that I sometimes have fear about.
I didn't really fed armor to work, and like the ritual of getting ready helps me create like a boundary around myself, and like I have certain rituals of boundary that I do before and after work.
I have a lot of curiosity.
Yeah.
But yeah, so glasses, there's a senior male therapist in my life who wears a blazer to work every day, and that's part of his attempted containment, whereas mine is much more about blocking being penetrated. And so it's interesting to sort of notice that we have kind of gendered experiences of ways that we're trying to show up at work and be available, and I have so many questions about why that's true, but it's interesting.
Yeah, and when you said that, when we first came into the room, you sat down and that turned, you're like, nope, and you came in, because we're hanging out. And I was talking about the situations where most of the times when we're talking to clients, they're on their knees in front of me, and the times when we've had conversations that necessitate, or they feel that they need to not be on their knees to have the conversation, or they feel like that's too vulnerable of a state to, it's actually more difficult for me to have the conversation as well. Like this idea of flooding, because it's not within my frame, right? It's slightly outside of my comfort level or what I was expecting.
Right, and this is my practice. This is part of my day-to-day routine. That's my chair. If anyone ever tried to sit in it, who I didn't give explicit permission to, I would be losing my mind.
Or if you have a client come in who,
which, funny funny enough, I hope my therapist is watching this. Hi, Regina. Actually, no, I'll maybe share it with her later. But the first time I went into her office, I did assess. I was like, is that your chair? Or, you know, like, I think I was a little bit challenging her authority. Yeah, because the frame is part of how we maintain our safety
and
as well as
there's power dynamics at play in psychoanalysis and in therapy.
Well, and there's also part of the expectation on both you and me is that we keep the people safe, right? Like, there are ways that we're playing with unsafety, for sure, and shit will come up, but it's also ultimately on us to make sure that somebody's driving home at the end of the party, and maybe that's not how you think about it. Like, I think about being kind of the designated driver at the thing.
Yeah, well, I think therapy is when it's good edge play. I think kink when it's good edge play, where you're like, you're like seeking these edges of what your comfort zone is,
right,
and figuring out like, why is this uncomfortable? And you're asking all these like self-inquiring questions, and it's always it's like always in. For me, like my experience of being very aware of transference and things coming up have always been when my DS relationships have like moved outside of an hour-long scene. So we were talking about it earlier, like two things come to my mind where there's like a very devoted submissive who we're spending like either overnights with or in contact with very often. And at some point there becomes a time where I'm unable to maintain that level of intimacy or attunement, or did we talk about the pedestal on camera?
We haven't talked about it.
Or this idea that like I'm then put up on a pedestal of this like idolized, like reified goddess, and then having a need that like doesn't align with like I need food, or like I'm gonna pass out because this corset's too tight. The change in me like stepping off of the pedestal, or me having a need that they don't want to have to think about my needs, because it's part of the fantasy, that is the space where conflict has come up, and that is the space where I sort of become like hyper cognizant of how, especially since I'm like very close with those people, how their previous relationships, particularly of early childhood caregivers, come into play, and then where I feel like I'm at a loss, and like where these conversations began is that I don't feel like I necessarily have the right tool set to navigate outside of this enactment. And so like my questions around that are sort of like, one, I think if you're going to have these conversations with someone as a therapist, there's the assumption that they're going to like talk about that in therapy. Yeah, exactly. And then I feel like as a sex worker, it's seen as such a personal relationship that I'm then expected to have that conversation for free, which I find very difficult. So then what comes up for me is that they're pushing that boundary of like access to my time, and like maybe something did come up, and like I can be accountable and take responsibility for like where I might have messed up, or like how I could have been more aware of how my changing boundaries would affect them. But it then what I've seen in like the two circumstances that I'm thinking of seeing it just sort of like devolve, and it feels like this like spiraling thing that like I'm not totally sure how to control, both out of like preservation for myself and my own boundaries, especially with the like super personal relationships. I feel like it can become very consuming to play this role out. I feel like it feels like exhausting to like play out what feels like a predetermined role of me being bad, rather than like having the space to like come to an alternate conclusion.
I have only like recognition for that feeling, and also awareness that the position that you are in is even harder than the one that I'm in, where I cross my fingers, because just because I'm a therapist doesn't mean that people show up for those kinds of conversations. If there's been some kind of rupture, it's not infrequent that means that our relationship is done and I don't get the chance to repair it either. But I do think that built into the framework, that's the place where the healing is. And that's what I try to set up for people when we first meet, is talking about how, and that we were talking about how this is now your practice of expectation setting on some level.
We were talking about like the similarities between like therapy expectation setting and like the negotiation for a scene, which I thought was interesting.
Right, so I try very hard at the beginning to say, I'm not a perfect person, I'm not a perfect therapist. There will be times, it is inevitable that there will be times where I will hurt your feelings, I'll misunderstand you, there'll be something that I do or say that's upsetting to you. I want to know about that because that's part of the work. And it is such a gift when people actually tell me what's going on and we can work through, okay, this was my experience of the thing, this was your experience of the thing, like, where the truth is clearly somewhere in the middle and we both are holding parts of the truth at this moment, and that is where the healing is. But there's something about therapy, at least, where we seem to have a better paradigm or something, or like it's more normalized that rupture is inevitable and repair is also possible.
Someone write that down.
We'll get that later.
Rupture is inevitable and repair is also possible. Yeah, and I feel like in my practice what I come up with is that it spirals so quickly because I think because of the like level of closeness that I have with people, that it doesn't feel possible to them and they don't, and like, but then when the frame is outside of like an hour's space, it's very difficult to then come back to that contained space. And like, especially once boundaries, like, I respond defensively once my boundaries are being crossed, and then they continue to cross the boundary, and then I need more boundaries to hold the space to have that conversation. It just makes it feel like further and further away.
Well, and I also get paid for that time. It's an assumption, and I think people don't want to do it, but I think some of them understand why that happens. Yeah. And it doesn't sound like that's an assumption that might happen for you.
Yes. Yeah.
But I absolutely interrupted you, I think. I had another thought. Go. I was thinking about how challenging it would be to have somebody be in the vulnerable position that they've asked you to put them in, right? Like, it's not like it came from nowhere, but there are a lot of levels of vulnerability that are at play in your work. And I think therapists definitely of other modalities play with that kind of purposeful regression, right? Like, there have been many modalities of therapy that are thinking about how to evoke the kinds of experiences. Like, I'm thinking about psychedelically informed psychotherapy, or there was like a rebirthing movement in the 70s. Like, there have been lots of therapeutic modalities that are trying to figure out how to get people to let their ego defenses down a little bit more so that they can do some work. But I think there's something that's especially hard when, like, nudity or sexuality or like the kinds of places where people play when we're playing with kink. It's like on another level of vulnerability. Right, it's like supposed to be.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. And it's funny that you say this, talking about regression, because a lot of the circumstances that, in my personal practice, that these things have come up with, age play has definitely been a part of it. And we've been like talking about like attunement and attachment, and like with how much I work with bodies and like pretty good at reading people, I am able to like attune very quickly in a session, especially when like the frame is there and like when I have the right music playing and we're in my space, and like when we're like taking this time to like not be on our phones and be together, that outside of that becomes very difficult. Or then when something does come up and someone's still in a regressed state, I don't feel like I necessarily have the right tool set.
I like that you think that we might. That seems nice. Good fantasy.
Okay, maybe that's my fantasy. But yeah,
I understand the impulse, because it does sound like things get bigger. Like, when people are regressed, it's very hard to communicate with them, like grown-ups.
And like I've had people like start referring to themselves as a boy, and like very, very clearly seeing in there like talking about themselves in the third person, and like being very aware of what's, like, I feel at some point like very aware of what's going on, but not always able to like guide it to like a reparative space. And like that feels so important to me, to like come together to like make meaning together rather than sticking to this one story that's happened before, and like finding ways to like allow each other to mess up and fuck up and be messy and still like find care and support in that and like come to meaning.
I share your hope.
Yeah.
I share your hope both for those people that you are experiencing this thing with, and also for all future people who are going to have the experience of evoking and re-encountering transferential stuff until it doesn't work anymore, or until they're ready enough to confront those parts of themselves that wanted a new outcome, or was willing to entertain that there could potentially be a new outcome. But that's a risk, because it means telling a totally new story.
Right. And people are often very attached to those stories. Because the support hasn't gotten us through a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing that came up about transference that I actually think we should make explicit? Transference isn't always a bad thing, right? Like, sometimes people are transferentially attached to me in ways that are useful or good. Like, some people only want to work with women therapists, and so I get some clients that other people might not get because I'm a woman therapist, and that's totally transference. They don't know anything about me. I could be such a bitch, and then, well, maybe that's what they're looking for too, but like, there's some fantasy. Right. Hold on. There's some fantasy about what it means to be a woman, or to be young, or to be whatever it is that they're trying to enact, and that's transference too. What were you going to say?
Could that be like a positive or a negative transference?
Some people use those words, yeah.
Be like, I don't want to work with a man therapist.
Yeah, that could be a negative transference potentially, or like, I don't know. Those aren't frameworks that I use, but I know that they exist. I think.
Stab at that.
Yeah, totally. Does that feel resonant to either the other people who have some therapeutic training, or maybe there are more? But
I think like labeling it in that way. I haven't always heard it labeled in that way, but I think it's interesting. Yeah, I think talk about it more as like generally, like that can. Whether you want a particular therapist because they're a woman, because they're a man, I think can provide like negative and positive connotations, but like not labeling it as positive or negative transference.
Right. But I do think that there are some paradigms where people will talk about positive or negative transference, and I think it's kind of related to negative feelings.
Oh, I guess I just meant moving towards, or like moving away from or moving towards something.
Nice. Oh, like getting the charge on the magnet? Yeah. Cute. I made that up. You don't. It doesn't work for you, or it does?
Oh, no, that's
okay. Great. Yeah. Other things that you guys maybe should we turn it over to these guys if they want to be on the?
If anyone has anything that wants to be in the video, we'll turn it off in like 2 minutes. I'm going to see if anyone's saying anything. If anyone has any questions, we got heart eye faces.
I'm so excited to see. Okay, I think all the hearts.
Yeah, I think just like my questions as we like move into the conversational part of it is like how do we know like what's ours and what's someone else's? I feel like it's like the eternal question. It's one of the eternal questions.
Well, I think it's so complicated. How do you know that?
Yeah.
Like, how do we know that ever? And like, go to therapy, meditate, do your own work, find ways to be able to figure those things out. Everyone needs to do it all the time. It's a never-ending process. The idea that you can be like fully analyzed and be done is total bullshit. And there's always going to be a new edge.
There's always work.
Yeah.
And then my other question is like, what are some ways that we can work to redirect the conversation when we feel it's like when we become aware of what's happening in our practice? Like, I don't know if you have any tips or like.
Yeah, it's a place where I don't know how we would do it. Like, I'd be so curious to hear from you guys about where you feel like your points of negotiation are. I don't know. Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll turn this off and we can like maybe like regroup with the internet if we need anything. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Does that sound good to everyone? Thank you. Okay.